Greetings, friends, and welcome back to the Musings from the Mount podcast. I'm your host, Joseph Carenza. In today's episode, a continuation of our Ponder on This series, Michael Lindfield and I explore something that's been essential to my own spiritual journey, the power of humor. We discuss how laughter helps us see ourselves clearly, breaks down rigid patterns, and creates space for growth and connection. So whether it's the court jester speaking truth to power, or the warm smile of the Buddha, humor has always been an underappreciated teacher on the spiritual path. Join us as we discover why, as Michael puts it, the wise ones are masters of mirth, and discover how a good laugh might be exactly what your soul needs. And we hope you enjoy the episode. And if you do enjoy this podcast, please consider going to meditationmount.org and donating. Your donation helps us to bring you this podcast, as well as all the other programs the Mount produces, both today and in the future. We are incredibly grateful and honored by your support. All right, back to the podcast and the masters of mirth. One of the things about humor, about comedy, that I find the most intriguing is the utter truthfulness about it. If someone tells a joke and you don't laugh, it didn't work. It's the ultimate test. If something is humorous, if you find it funny, if people find it funny, there's an element of revelation to it, of truth.
It rings true.
It rings true. And it also has the rare ability to, it can disengage, it can de-escalate. Gallows humor. When you're able, as a culture, a lot of cultures sometimes have a ingrained sense of humor that is often wry or very dark. I think like sort of the dark British humor.
Yes.
I think that was my first introduction to that kind of, and I loved it so much.
Well, it got us through the Second World War, as my parents would say.
Exactly, and so that informed my sense of humor as a young teenager. Discovering Monty Python, discovering Faulty Towers. Different. Different. It was so different than the American version of humor, which was a little more slapstick, a little more. But even that, it serves this purpose, and for me, but one of the greatest things about humor too is that it can speak truth to power in sense of the role of the jester.
Right. That's a very good point, because you had the court jester who was allowed to say anything to anybody. Mm-hmm. And I know there was a couple of times where many times people have said to me, "Michael, you're a fool," and I've sort of said, "Thank you for the compliment, but I don't think I deserve it because I'm not wise enough yet to play the fool."
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I was a little bit facetious in saying that, but that's what I meant. When you see, a fool, the true fool is the court jester. That means you have to see everything that's happening and present it back without it being an insult, but it reveals what is.
Yeah.
And it's like glaring.
Absolutely.
But it's not there to poison the field. It's there to reveal. Mm-hmm. And I think that's it. And one of the things I've noticed with people on the spiritual path, it's like I met when I was a macrobiotic, which is where you just eat the foods that are grown in your region and all that. And it's all absolutely wonderful. But the group of macrobiotics that I was working with in Sweden were some of the dullest people. They had no sense of humor. And basically what you were cared about was whether you chewed your food 40 times.
Right. Yeah.
And there weren't many laughs.
That's not a lot. Yeah. That's not a lot of laughs.
Not a lot of laughs. And I'm just using that as an example because often in the spiritual tradition, we have what I call pseudo-seriousness, where we believe that in order to be spiritual, and appear spiritual to yourself and to others, you have to have this bearing that is a stern face.
Yeah.
And what I'd like to do as part of our exploration is to go and see what the Master DK, the Tibetan, says about humor. And also Roberto Assagioli, who is the inspiration behind Meditation Mount back in the early 60s, he wrote a paper called Smiling Wisdom. And there's some wonderful quotes in there about humor. I like to draw upon that. Plus, when I was thinking this morning about this, several things came to mind about the role of humor in my life. And you've already pointed to one, which is that I grew up in a British society where you use dry humor or dark humor just to alleviate and give some relief to the suffering, and just to not to make light of it, but to lighten it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and there's a big difference, and so one of the things I wanted to say from the beginning is humor always needs to be self-reflective. Humor is there to help us see ourselves as others see us, as Shakespeare would say.
Yeah,
to see yourselves as others see us. And therefore, it can't be used as an attack. It can't be used to denigrate somebody. A lot of the humor that you listen to with stand-up comics is usually dissing some part of society or someone. And when I grew up, it was always the mother-in-law that got the brunt of everything.
Yeah, that's true.
And it was like,
they'll like take my wife, please jokes.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Oh.
And it was at the expense of. Mm-hmm. It was humor at the expense of somebody. Right. What we're doing is humor as a self-reflective mechanism. And for me, it's a digestive aid. So when back in the 1970s, the mid-70s, I was teaching my first course on esoteric philosophy, I used a lot of humor and cartoons and drew funny little diagrams because that way people smiled and laughed. And when you smile and laugh, exactly what you said earlier, you recognize it's a recognition. Mm-hmm. When you laugh, it's because you recognize the truth in it.
Yeah.
And normally it's like, right, I resemble that remark, as the Marx Brothers would say.
Yes. So that's what I love. I love, my favorite subject of humor is, and this was something, on tour that, backstage, everyone is always constantly ripping on each other. And I loved it because it helped reveal to me, like it helps me feel like a real person and to connect with people. And I loved it when people would make fun of me. And it was also a way too, is like, it was a way for, as a tour manager, like when the crew would make fun of you, it was a way kind of to bridge that gap, and it was a way for so it just felt like there was a camaraderie to it.
Thank you. So for me, the number one rule is it's a self-reflective tool. It's not an instrument to inflict harm, denigration, ridicule.
Yeah.
I remember when I lived in the Findhorn community in northern Scotland, I was there for 14 years. I came in the early 70s. We used to have every Friday evening, we gather in the dining room and then later in this big hall that we built. But every Friday evening, we gathered to have a Friday evening sharing. Mm-hmm. Well, we'd tell stories and we'd sing songs, and we had a skit gang. We had this group, not quite as professional as Monty Python, but we would make fun of ourselves so we wouldn't take ourselves so seriously.
Yeah.
And we would have, somebody would do a skit on a meditation contest. Who could come up with the most wonderful vision, but it was always to make sure that we didn't get too big for our boots, as we say in Britain.
Yeah, it's important.
And the other thing is that when you make fun of yourself, you keep things in perspective. Mm-hmm. And so humor can help keep things in perspective when things get out of whack, either because they're so traumatic. But it doesn't mean with all the pain and the suffering in the world, you laugh it off. But you've got to hold it in a way, it allows you to hold things that you couldn't if you were just holding it in pain. I don't know how else to say it, but there are a couple of times when we crossed the line in this skit gang where we found ourselves saying something about a person and they took offense. Well, sometimes people take offense because they're not willing to see what is being mirrored back to them. Sure. But then there's another time when if the intent in the giving has a little bit of a charge to it, so it can't have a charge.
Yeah.
It has to be the self-reflective mirror that you use for yourself and for the group. And that way, it keeps things healthy. So we did it every week. We would make fun of ourselves or not take ourselves too seriously. And I guess what I want to do in a second is read a couple of passages from the Tibetan, the Master DK, because he's basically saying what we're talking about now. You take life seriously, but you don't take yourself too seriously.
Yeah, I think
that for me is the key. That's the bottom line in all of this, Joey.
Right. And I think especially for an organization specifically like ours and people that are in the spiritual esoteric community, the ability to not take yourself seriously is sort of a preventative measure from becoming a cult or becoming a cult of personality or becoming, a multi-level marketing.
Well, I told you that after the Jim Jones catastrophe,
right?
We had at Findhorn, we had people from News of the World and Daily Mirror and all the Sundays coming up from London to interview us. I remember one newspaper journalist asked me, because Peter Caddy was the male figure at Findhorn, along with Eileen Caddy, his wife, and Dorothy McLean. They were the three co-founders. So, would you follow Peter Caddy if he told you to? And we just sort of looked at him and said, "Are you joking? You think we'd die for Peter?" It's like, no. I mean, this he's a wonderful person, but it's not a cult.
Right.
We're not fixated on him as the living word.
Right.
He's a wonderful example of what it takes to plant a cosmic seed in the terrestrial soil of Earth and get things started, an initiative started.
Yeah.
But we're not going to die for him. No, we're going to live for what he planted, but not die for him as a person.
Yeah. I think that's an important thing, and I think that's that falls right along with the power of humor. There's a liveliness to it. You have to be alive. It evokes an energy in you. It refreshes you. It's a cleansing. It cleanses the palate.
Well, it does. I mean, we could have started this podcast off by saying, a funny thing happened to me on the way to the podcast,
Yes.
but I wouldn't know what to say after that.
That's right.
But what I'd like to do is to read a couple of passages from the Tibetan, because we've been doing this ponder on this. And so let's hook that back into some of his words and see what he says. May I, in all earnest, offer to you the paradoxical injunction to work with utter earnestness, and yet at the same time to refuse to work with such earnestness and not to take yourself so earnestly. Those who stand on the inner side and study the work of the world aspirants today see an almost pitiful distress of individual deficiency, a sustained and strenuous effort on their part to make themselves what they ought to be, and yet at the same time, a distressing lack of proportion and no sense of humor whatsoever. So I urge upon you to cultivate both these qualities. Do not take yourself so seriously, and if you will find that you will release yourself for freer and more potent work. So he says if you don't take yourself seriously, you're looser, more flexible, and able to respond to the call.
Yeah.
But take life seriously.
Yeah. Yeah. I always took that idea that I take my work seriously, but I wouldn't take myself too seriously.
Well, when I was a consultant in the corporate world and working with large groups and doing major interventions with departments, I would say, look, just to let you know, I treat this as serious fun. Mm-hmm. We're going to enjoy ourselves together, but this is serious because we have a clear goal, an intent, an objective. And yet getting there, we're going to be, if you like, lighthearted about it, but not lighthearted meaning frivolous. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a big distinction. For instance, the production company that puts out these podcasts through Meditation Mountain is called Heartlight Productions. Mm-hmm. We call it Heartlight rather than lighthearted, because lighthearted is you carry yourself in a lighthearted way, but it also can give you the indication that we don't take things too seriously.
Yeah.
So we're not talking about being frivolous. Mm-hmm. Heart-lighted is when the joy and the wisdom of the soul shines its light on your life, and it shows that what you're facing is not the end of the world. It's just the next test on the path.
Yeah.
And we covered this in that whole series we did, the 5 series on initiation.
That's right.
So humor is important to, on the path, to keep things in proportion and right perspective, not to use it as a defense mechanism to deny what's in front of me.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I mean,
it's not a smokescreen.
That's right. That's right. I mean, I found it very interesting that, when I first started to get to know Leonard Cohen and get to know and work with him. I mean, this is someone whose work is very, very serious, very dark. It was also often written that his album should come with razor blades, so I didn't know what to expect. But my literal first interaction with him was him kind of making the funniest of jokes. It just he was at a show for his lady friend, and he was very tired, so he ended up back in the dressing room and slept through most of the show. And then she came off stage. He rose from the dead. He just rose, and he's like, "Oh, darling, that was beautiful." And he hadn't seen it. I don't think he'd seen a single note. I was like, "You sly guy," and he was actually the funniest person I've ever met. And but at the same time, his work ethic was incredible. And yet he has a line in one of his later records he calls himself a lazy bastard living in a suit. But I've never seen, I mean, he worked harder at his craft than anyone I've ever met.
Well, I think this is what DK's saying. And if I could just complete the last sentence, it emphasizes that. Yeah. Take the plan seriously and the call to serve, but waste not time in constant self-analysis.
Ooh. That's relevant in 2024 because this is what we're all engaged in, is this constant cycle of self-analyzation.
But if you just keep digging and digging and digging, you actually at some point have got to sow seeds in the ground that you've been digging in. So there's a point where you can overdo it, I believe. It doesn't mean you don't address the trauma and you don't release the toxins that have been accumulated over the years.
Yeah.
But sometimes it gets heavy.
Yeah.
And so, did you want to add anything else?
No, I mean, I might here and there, but it was, I just had so many of my memories of it's just laughing with Leonard. And it was no one, he would tell stories where he was with such honesty about things where he was the person in the wrong. He was the villain in the story, and he would pull no punches. And we would be roaring, laughing about the stuff that he did. And you think, wouldn't you want to cover that up? Why would you be but no, it was so brilliant.
But you see what he was doing. Yeah. It was the light of his soul saying, look, my personality, which is evolving and has faults.
Yeah.
Faults means it's still growing. It's still evolving. It's not perfect.
Yeah.
And this is what this imperfect journey looks like towards perfection.
Yeah.
But if you hold yourself to be a representative of truth and you are covering up all your cracks and your faults, you're living a lie.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So humor helps to reveal the truth of what is without ridiculing the place on the path of unfoldment you're at, because you're not perfect. And by admitting I'm not perfect doesn't mean I'm not a spiritual person. It means the spirit in me is seeking to build an instrument where its beauty, its truth, and its goodness can show up in the world. And yet at the moment, it's slightly flawed. And here's a funny example. What happened to me once when? And then you show, hey, I was all set to do this, and this happened.
Yeah.
And then everyone goes, yeah, I can relate to that. So the humor is really saying to ourselves and saying to others, yeah, I can relate to that. And then it makes it okay to grow. And the big thing, I go back to the corporate world, the big thing was, are you willing to admit that you've made a mistake?
See, that's the important part, is humor gives you that space for that. And that's in our culture, definitely our corporate culture, it's almost this institutional ingrained that we never apologize, we never admit wrong, because one, you don't want to be sued, you open yourself up to liability. But I believe that with humor, it's so important, because how else can you learn and grow?
Well, and one of the things we learned when we were doing this continuous quality improvement work is what you need is accurate, honest data.
Right.
So unless you're willing to tell the truth, then if a decision is data driven and the data is distorted,
that's right.
Guess what? So a little bit of humor and hubris, you know.
Yeah. Or a spoonful of sugar to help the medicine go down.
Absolutely.
I always thought that the whole Mary Poppins, but there's a lot of genius in that Walt Disney movie, along with some great tunes. But I think it's interesting too, from the perspective of institutions as groups and group endeavor, like how. Like, it was very interesting hearing you talk about Findhorn, but like, how can we incorporate, because people are very sensitive now, how can we incorporate the humor into our lives?
Well, you see, this is where you have to make sure you don't inadvertently touch a button, because the sensitivity meter is so...
It is. It's a very... Because like when I was just in my lifetime, I mean, the difference between what was acceptable to joke about to now, I mean, it's just night and day different.
Well, the thing is, because you don't want to cause anybody offend anybody.
Right.
Now this, no, I'm going to dare to say something. There's a fine line between not offending somebody, but pointing something out which is a reality that we need to explore more together.
Mm-hmm.
Rather than saying, no, I'm sorry, that topic is taboo, it's off the table.
Right.
If it's off the table, then we don't have a clear relationship with it. When I have a clear relationship with something, then I can talk about it.
Yeah.
But what I mustn't do is use humor to insult, cause harm, to denigrate. So it's often said that humor can't be like an arrow with a barb on the end that you fire at somebody. It has to be self-reflective.
Yeah.
It has to be, it's like a boomerang, it comes back to you. Which reminds me, last week, my daughter told me that my 5-year-old grandson had been watching a video on the Aboriginal people of Australia. Mm-hmm. And he made up a joke at the end. And he said, Mummy, what do you call a boomerang that doesn't come back? He's 5 years old. And she says, no, what is it? He said, a stick. And I thought, how brilliant, because you see how he's processing his thoughts. So humor actually can show you another way of looking at another lens.
Absolutely. That's what I love about it.
So you don't get stuck.
Yeah. I mean, it's the revelatory nature of humor. And for me, it's been a huge part of my personal growth, of being able to laugh at myself. It took me, it broke so many patterns because my family I didn't come from a family where we were self-reflective. I didn't come from a family where we joked and had good nature ribbing or anything like that. Everyone was very serious, and everyone's opinion was sacrosanct. And just there was it was a high like very high level of like respect culture. Some Mediterranean respect culture, which me being more of a jester, I just found exhausting. So being able to laugh at yourself and see these things and not take yourself so seriously actually led to my spiritual growth. It was a huge part of my spiritual growth and continues to be so.
Well, because it allows you to look at yourself, whereas before I'm not willing to look at the darkness because the darkness is bad, and we've gone over this in the last number of episodes. The darkness inside of you is the darkness of your own ignorance, the darkness of your own unenlightened aspect. It's not bad, it's not evil. There's a big difference between evil and the darkness of unillumined consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
Humor reveals that.
Yeah.
Now, you've just prompted me to realize there are many roles of humor, and I've spoken about this person before. When I was at Findhorn, the person called Robert Ogilvy Crombie, R.O.C., Rock, we called him. He was the one that had very deep relationship with the forces of nature. He was able to converse with the elemental beings, the gnomes and the fairies, and that was his gift. And he was also our guardian. He was like a Gandalf figure. And he said occasionally he'd meet these beings who were a little on the troublesome side and wanted to do mischief. And he had a way of checking out, because he said some of them are masters of disguise. They clothe themselves in light robes like Saruman in Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
And it's not white, really, but it gives the illusion. So what he would do, he would have two ways of finding out who they really were. One of them was the classic way, in the name of the Holy Trinity, I command you to reveal the true nature of who you are. Wow, okay, can't refuse that one. It's an offer you can't refuse. The other one was he would make fun of them. Oh, that's a funny nose you got. Did you bump into a tree? And he said if the being said, yeah, I know it happens all the time, he'd go, right, good. But if he took offense, he'd know that the only beings that take offense are the ones who are constricted and live in this dark place. And when he explained that to me, because that was one of the ways he did his litmus test, was to use humor as a litmus test.
I love it.
And I thought, wow, no, I haven't tried that because I don't live in that world. But I suddenly realized that he was saying that somebody treading the spiritual path takes life seriously, but not themselves seriously. And so he was testing those that took themselves with self-importance, and therefore, if you can't say anything about me, because if you say anything about my appearance, then you are, you're dissing me. You're not respecting me. And he had that approach, and I found that when he explained that, I went, oh wow, thank you. I got to watch out. If I, Michael, react to some humorous self-reflection, then I know that I'm trapped. I'm caught in something.
Yeah, that pattern's got a hold of you. The pattern is becoming your personality. And I mean, one thing that happens for me too, and I am always reminded of the statues of Buddha with the ones that have a slight smirk. And I always wondered what the story with that was. And then once I started meditating, something that happens pretty often for me is during a meditation, I'll be overcome with this intense, warm sense of like I'm gonna laughter almost, but not I get this big grin on my face, and it's the most beautiful thing because I see this I just see the ridiculousness of it all and the humor of it all, and I feel a sense of peace.
Well, in fact, I call the wise one the masters of mirth.
Okay.
Not because they're just sort of joking and not taking life seriously, but they hold it in a light way. They're heart-lighted.
Yeah.
And I remember one of the people that was foundational at Findhorn and we looked to as a point of reference said, oh, the masters of wisdom, they're really laughter incarnate. And I thought, wow, that's, be careful what you say. And then I realized, no, they are the joy of life that always is celebrating life and seeking to perfect it. And the way you perfect it, you can't perfect something unless you're aware of what is needed to be perfected. And one of the tools of self-awareness is the looking in the humorous mirror of life, or through the humorous lens. So and yet people say, yeah, but how can you talk about this on this podcast and when there's so much suffering in the world and there's so much angst, there's so much, how can you? And it's the same thing as you have, when you think about, when you go to the theater, you see these two masks superimposed, tragedy and comedy. They're not separate. They are always joined together. They're always superimposed on each other.
Right.
So I think the tragedy and comedy go together.
I also think that if you're on this path, part of what you're doing is, obviously you're resolving your shadow self, but that concept that if you look into the abyss looks into you. But if you can laugh about it, you somehow you take a little bit of that power away. If it's that ability to regain a footing in the abyss, and so the darkness becomes, it becomes a place that you can spruce up.
there's one more quote from the Tibetan that he gives in his Discipleship in the New Age, which is a series of instructions for people on the path. And this is about humor. There are two things that every disciple must someday learn, my brother. One is to cultivate the ability to sit light in the saddle, to use an old proverbial injunction, and the other is to develop a sense of humor, a real, not forced capacity to laugh at oneself and with the world, not at it, with the world. Mm-hmm. This is one of the compensations which comes to those who can succeed in working in the light upon the mental plane. Mm. Now, what does he mean by working in the light on the mental plane? He means you see the truth of what is, and therefore your humor isn't an emotional reaction to somebody. You're not hurling something back at them,
right?
Like an emotional insult. Mm-hmm. And so it goes back to when you can see things for what they are. So humor is a way of holding things in right perspective, right proportion. Mm. That's another way of looking at it. So those were the quotes from the Tibetan. Now there is we use the Agni Yoga teachings here at the Mounts, and the Agni Yoga teachings are the yoga of fire, and it's all about striving and sacrifice, and it sounds heavy duty, but there's only one quote on humor in all of the books, and I want to read it because this was written back in 1937. Each book of the teaching carries an inner task. If brutality can make fun of brotherhood, this will be the worst kind of savagery. Let people find the strength to restrain themselves from derision. Derision is not acuteness of mind. Humor is contained in a wise attitude toward events taking place, but the gaping mouth of the dull-witted is a disgrace to humanity. Is it a game when humanity becomes the plaything of madness? They will meet with success who uplift the chalice with clean hands. Mm. So when you use humor as a way to uplift and to shine the light, it's a useful tool. Mm-hmm. But when it harms and imprisons, no. So I think all these traditions are saying similar things.
Yeah.
I mean, in the Bible, you've got the book of Proverbs, you've got all this. You don't have a book of one-liners in there. It would be lovely to have one of the books in the Bible. Okay, here are some one-liners.
That would be nice. We should add a book to the Bible.
So, yeah. And then you get the classic dad jokes as well. And this is another way of disarming some of the heaviness around the father figure. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
I noticed that because when I make a dad joke is successful when people groan. Mm-hmm. And when people groan, then they don't see you as this all-powerful, whatever you would call it, infallible personage. Oh, God, it's a dad joke. Yeah. And it's a way of keeping that in perspective, because to keep the balance between the parents and children, because you're all souls at different stages of unfolding, and the parents have been given the responsibility of helping these souls land and be clothed and fed, and at some point, they're going to continue, and these souls may be further along the path than the parents.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
And so it goes back to humor is a way of making sure that you keep the field light enough to live in.
Yeah. And that's very important because the field can be kind of heavy these days.
It can.
And I mean, there's something to that. If we didn't laugh, we would cry. And not, but at the same time, I find the ability to laugh, and this is one of the reasons why I love Douglas Adams so much is, like there's, when you can see the absurdity and you laugh at it, but there's one thing that ties Douglas Adams' kind of characters and his stories is that you continue to move forward. You don't give up, you get on with your day,
Right. So humor does not allow you to wallow in self-pity.
Right.
If you use it correctly.
And for the depressive culture we have now, like that's a very, very powerful tool.
But if humor is used in an incorrect way now, it's seen as another way of lashing out at somebody or say, dissing them, to use that phrase. So there are other things that we can talk about. For instance, Roberto Assagioli, as I said earlier, who's the inspiration behind Meditation Mountain, back in the 60s, wrote a paper called Smiling Wisdom. And the first sentence says, "The ancients greatly appreciated laughter, which they looked upon as a divine gift and a helpful remedy." That's how he starts it off.
Yeah.
And he said there are above all three things which a modern person must learn in order to become a sane and complete being: the art of resting, the art of contemplation, the art of laughing and smiling. So he gave those three keys.
Yeah.
And he said, in order to become a sane and complete being.
I like that. That's important. This is big.
The art of resting, the art of contemplation, and the art of laughing and smiling. So, and then he goes into, because he was a psychologist, but he had an understanding of the physiology of the human. He'd said, laughing has, first of all, a direct salutary effect upon our bodies. It's known that laughing produces rapid rhythmical contractions of the diaphragm. These rhythmical contractions have a healthful effect on the abdominal organs, stimulating their functions and activating the digestive secretions, especially those of the liver. It also modifies the rhythm of breathing, stimulates the pulmonary function and the activity of the heart, and therefore produces a better oxidization. So the proverb which says, laughing makes good blood, is therefore scientifically accurate. And we've said that before, that laughter, it oxygenates the blood. Joy oxygenates the blood.
Yes, it does. Yeah.
And when you are bitter, it makes, if you like, the blood more, the pH level of the blood goes right down to the acid level.
Yeah. I think that's a very important point to maybe linger on a little bit. You just, the difference is huge. I mean, I find it for myself, like there's no better medicine for me than laughter.
Oh, I grew up with, as you say, Britain. I grew up with something called The Goon Show, which was Spike Milligan, Peter Sellers, Harry Seacombe, these three crazy people who were just off the wall. And they were off the wall because they just survived the Second World War. One of them with shell shock.
Yeah.
Spike Milligan, he was damaged, he knew that. But they were just breaking down the barriers by just doing ridiculous things and feeding back, if you like, the insanity of the way that society was living and relating to itself. And I grew up with that. As a 7 or 8, 9-year-old, I would listen to my radio at night, and it didn't make much sense, but it imprinted in me this. It was irreverence for the humanly constructed, if you like, class system.
Oh, right. Yeah.
But it gave me an appreciation for just the humanness of who we are.
Yeah.
So Assagioli then moves on to say about the psychological value, and he said that the psychological value of laughter is much greater than the physiological. He says laughter removes the inner tension with consequent great relief to the individual. It brings with it a beneficent release and replaces the activity of tired functions by the fresh use of others which have been little and too little employed. So when one is tired or excited, it is easier to relax through laughter than through outer activity. And then he says another useful function of laughter consists in it being a harmless and happy outlet for repressed tendencies, especially the tendency to play, which has remained alive in us and which we do not take enough into consideration. Too early and too harshly do we repress the little child which dwells in us with its fresh gaiety and its need for free and happy playing. But this urge to play can be reawakened it can bloom once more and exhilarate us like a stream of fresh and pure water that issues from a mountain crevice.
Well,
So he's just saying that sometimes and that's, I think, where, when I was looking at the children that grew up during the Troubles, quote unquote, in Northern Ireland, they grew up, their playground was the streets which were littered with the refuse of conflict.
Right,
and they didn't, and same with in Palestine.
Yeah.
And all these places where the children have grown up and haven't been able to play freely and happily as souls. And therefore, that whole developmental cycle, which is fueled by the freedom just to be and play and imagine and be happy in your own world, has been taken away. Because another world has been thrust upon them, which is brutal, which is not safe.
Yeah.
And so there is a lot of psychological damage from the fact that we haven't had the freedom of play and humor and the lightness of life.
Right. Yeah.
But it's not too late to reclaim. As the Bible says, be like little children. It doesn't say be childish, it says be childlike.
Right. Yeah, which is, that's just the beginner's mind is important, as we know, to being creative. And I also found it interesting too. My sense of humor, I guess, was greatly informed by the, post World War II British humor. But the role, I think, in the esoteric community, we are dealing with topics and doctrine that people take very seriously and very dear to their heart. What is the role of humor in terms of having no sacred cows, being able to talk about any subject or being able to explore something, the breaking down of the taboo, because so much of esoteric and occult knowledge is kind of falls into it is almost sacrosanct. There's a very, very kind of firm, almost dogmatic approach sometimes.
Well, it goes back to what we said, take life seriously. So take the principles seriously.
Yeah.
But the forms that currently convey the principles, don't let them become sacred cows, because they become ossified. They become crystallized as the only way to express the principles.
Right.
And these evolve all the time. The evolution of the form that expresses the principles is constant. But if we freeze it in time and say, you will not make fun of this, then you have to take it, what I call, in a pseudo-serious way. It's like, no, you must make fun of it because this is the truth, as though the truth is something stern. The truth is love, for God's sake.
Isn't there also something to the idea that if something really is the truth, then it's strong enough to be able to withstand sort of inquiry and that sort of, which was the point of the jester, right? The jester showed that the king was strong enough to take a little ribbing,
Well, and the fact that the king has no clothes.
Yeah, right.
The emperor has no clothes.
Right.
It dispels the myths, the mists.
Yeah.
So that's what the jester does, is help dispel the mists of illusion around something, which is what we've gone into in great depth in the initiation and the whole thing of the astral plane. The way you dispel the mists is to bring lightness and to bring warmth to it. Well, humor contains lightness and warmth in its purest sense.
Right. So I think that's something we love about the great comedians who are able to tell us these things about ourselves and get us to laugh at ourselves. And in terms of group and social cohesion, this is the sitting around the campfire, telling stories and laughing, and it creates an important part of the culture.
Well, Assagioli later on in this essay talks about how it can be used in teaching and education. He says laughter has another remarkable use in teaching. It indicates with certainty whether a pupil does or does not understand what is being taught. With the ordinary methods, the teacher has no direct and sure proof of the student's understanding and has to ask him to definite questions to make sure of it. While when he presents the subject matter in a playful way, he can see at once by the reaction of the student whether or not he has understood.
That's a very good point. You can't that's the ultimate test if you understand the subject is that can you make a joke about it or can you?
Or you'd have a response to it.
Yeah, I love it. That's a very good point.
Yeah. And he says, thanks to its mnemonic value, laughter is very useful in facilitating the study of arid subjects that are based primarily on memory.
Right.
There exists, for instance, a French book on anatomy in which the subject is dealt with in an amusing manner. And I recall having used it with pleasure when I studied that dry science. And he said, in the same way, it can be amusing, like Alberto Cavalieri wrote Chemistry in Verses, and he found it a great aid in remembering the property of various chemical substances. It's like rhyming, rhyming alphabet, or something where it's funny, it's humorous. I mean, Dr. Seuss comes to mind.
Sure. Or a lot of the sort of folk wisdom and stuff like that, especially I think I'm not sure if this is true with every culture, but the British have a kind of a rhyming scheme that goes along with your sort of common and folk knowledge, that it makes it very easy to remember.
Well, I told you, when history, if you ask me when was the Great Plague and the Great Fire of London, I can tell you immediately.
Yeah.
In 1665, very few people were left alive. That's the plague.
Right.
In 1666, all that was left was burnt out sticks. Now, that's the Fire of London.
Yeah.
No, I mean, that's with me.
Right.
I don't have to think, what was it, 65, 60? No.
Yeah.
That is part of the story.
So it's almost like the human being, human soul has comedy receptors that are very useful for the full flowering of your soul's existence.
Well, and in fact, just to wrap this up, using some of the wisdom of Roberto, his smiling wisdom, he says, laughter can also have great moral and spiritual value. I said can have, for assuredly not every kind of laughter has that quality. It is therefore necessary to distinguish clearly between the different types and levels of laughter. There is the vulgar, gross laughter, a simple enjoyment of the instincts, which, alas, is only too widespread. Then there is sarcasm, contempt, mockery, which can be called acidified laughter, which is what we're talking about, the pH of it, and which may produce dangerous psychological auto-intoxication. And we've named this before, is that every thought we emit has a chemical attached to it. So pure humor would have beneficial nutrients and chemicals attached to them.
Yeah.
Where if I am being mean to you and vitriolic, my humor is toxic.
That's right. Yeah. I think that's what I've always loved about great comedians is the way that they're able to reveal a truth. I guess it is personal. There's something you see something of yourself in the joke, right. and you feel like in some ways you feel seen and understood because and you also it's a way for me it's just a way almost like the universe is finding a way to sort of gently inform you about maybe you need to work on something.
Right, and in fact. Assagioli adds another sentence here. Then he said, then there is finally the simple, inoffensive, comical laughter, such as is produced by puns, limericks, etc., which has no moral value, does not pretend to have any. It's unpretentious, but it's funny.
Yeah.
I mean, I love puns. I grew up with puns because it was just, it was just a way of just playing with things. It was like playing with toys. Yeah. So puns for me are like playing with toys.
Right. Yeah.
I won't even give you examples of.
For those around the Meditation Mount community, we know a Michael Lindfield pun.
I was limited to one a day by my family.
Oh.
Oh yeah. So it says Roberto Assagioli concludes all of this by saying the spiritual value of laughter depends on the intention of the one who arouses it. There exists, for instance, literary expressions of the comical, such as satire, parody, and comedy, which sometimes have a social and ethical value if the purpose of the author is to denounce hypocrisy and immorality or to unmask pretensions and vanities. I mean, they're remarkable examples of this function of the comical are the comedies of Molière and Orwell's satires. So you may not think George Orwell was funny.
I mean,
it's pretty heavy duty when you read 1984 Animal Farm.
Right.
But it's holding up a mirror. And then when you've got Animal Farm and all the animals doing their thing, you have to you smile at it because, oh my God, that's what that pattern looks like when it thinks it's, infallible and it rules and it's the best.
Yeah.
The pig's in charge or whatever it is, or whoever's in charge on the farm.
That's true. And those parallels are so evident. And yeah, I mean, and I also find it interesting how each culture has its own flavor of comedy that speaks directly to it. And it's one way to really understand. If you can understand what a group laughs at, what they find funny, you can relate to them in almost an instantaneous way.
Well, we talked about, we need to have another book of the Bible that has one-liners in it. In fact, Roberto Assagioli, I've just noticed in this essay, he said, one of the most useful tasks of humor is to unmask hypocrites and ill-wishers. It as used very appropriately by Jesus in his reply to the Pharisees who had put to him a captious question. They wanted to corner him. Then went the Pharisees and took counsel how they might entangle him in his talk. This is quoting from the Bible. And they sent out unto him their disciples with the Herodians, saying, Master, we knew that thou art true and teachest the way of God in truth. Neither carest thou for any man, for thou regardest not the person of men. He's like, Tell us therefore, what thinkest thou? Is it lawful to give tribute unto Caesar or not? Because he just said you shouldn't, highlight and spotlight any one person. Then they're saying, because they're the Romans, but don't you give tribute to Caesar? So this is where they wanted to corner him. But Jesus perceived their wickedness and said, Why tempt ye me, ye hypocrites? Show me the tribute money. And they brought unto him a penny. And he said unto them, Whose is the image and superscription? And they said unto him, Caesar's. Then he said unto them, Render therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things which are God. And when they heard these words, they marveled, and they left him and went their way. This is from Matthew chapter 22.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, so you can disarm. It's like tactica reversa. You just turn it around, and there's no answer. Because if somebody tries to corner you by saying, "Well, do you believe in this? Do you believe in this? Which is better?"
There's also the trust factor. I mean, this is strictly personally for me. I find it very hard to trust anyone, especially anyone who has any sort of authority, if they can't laugh at themselves. So, the sense of humor to me is a sign of, it's a sign of intellect and emotional development, but it is very difficult to work with and for people that can't laugh at themselves or can't have a sense of humor. And I wonder what is the group dynamic of that? How is, from esoterically, that trust in humor? It's a litmus test of humor,
I believe, speaking personally, how else can you speak?
Yes.
People, let me tell you what I really think.
Speaking impersonally.
Yes, or let me tell you the truth. You mean you haven't been telling me the truth up to now? Yeah, let me speak truthfully. Well, what was what you said before then?
Yeah.
And when people say that, I go, what? I want, before I respond to that, I want to use the last thing that Roberto Assagioli wrote in his essay on Smiling Wisdom. He said, spiritual humor is a paradoxical combination of an attitude of serene and detached observation, the feeling of the oneness of life, and a deep sympathy for and compassion with others.
Oh, all right.
And then he said, the humorist, writes Professor Fanciulli in his essay on humor, is to the highest degree gifted with the ability of living the life of others. He feels the ties which binds all things. Plurality is relative. perhaps only seeming. All parts are linked to each other by ties which cannot be broken. An admirable synthesis is effected. The pain and pleasure of others becomes the pain and pleasure of the self. This sympathy has the quality of tenderness. It partakes of the sufferings of the weak, of the conquered, of the poor. So he's saying spiritual humor is while you can embrace and hold everything in your heart. So it being heart-lighted.
Right.
I mean, that was the final quote from this essay of Roberto Assagioli, written 60 plus years ago. So how would you answer your own question?
I mean, for me, I think it's a very, very deeply held litmus test for me. Like you have to be able to laugh at yourself, and I think that goes for a person, an institution, a doctrine, whether it's a religion or an ice cream shop. I feel like you have to have some sense of humor, about yourself.
Because in the end, all that remains in the end is the truth. Mm-hmm. It goes back to, we've used this example of whether it's Michelangelo carving David, you've got the block of marble. Mm-hmm. Then what does he do? He takes away all that isn't David, i.e. removes the not self, to remove the self, the truth.
Yeah.
So humor is a way of chiseling away the not self.
Mm-hmm. I like that. Yeah, that makes sense.
And if you can't chisel away the not self and you're attached to it, you're not going to reveal the truth of who you are. You're going to become a block of marble. Mm-hmm. And one of my favorite series of sculptures in Florence is, I think it's either 4 or 5 of them, where it starts out with a block and you see a hand and a leg and a face, and then the next one there's more of the arm coming out and the leg, and in the end you've got the fully revealed. It shows you the revelation of the truth that's locked within the form.
Yeah.
And I believe that what you've just described is a way of using humor as a tool to chisel away at the blockages, to remove the not self, and to remove the David or the truth. So it's an artistic tool.
Yeah, it's also in some ways a philosophical razor. You get down to the core of any truth.
Well, yeah, and I've also thought that wouldn't it be lovely to have like a spiritual stand-up comedy evening somewhere where you could do this. And I'm thinking, well, at my age, it's probably I'd do sit-down comedy. I wouldn't do stand-up.
Right, okay.
But in order to shine a light on it, and then to demystify. That was one of the things at Findhorn that we said, what you do to approach the mystical. Well, first of all, you have to remove the mist, the clouds, but you must leave the tickle.
Okay. All right.
That's how you approach the mystical. You remove the mist, leave the tickle.
All right. I love it. Oh man. I don't know if we could find a better way to end this episode. That's good. The mystical. Okay.
Well, yeah, let's remove the clouds, the not self, all the illusion. Yeah. But let's leave the tickle, the thing that warms the heart, the thing that unites us.
Right.
Which is this deep love. And love has no bounds. And love includes, and love does not separate. So loving humor is a way that we can warmly embrace each other.
Yeah.
And see what still remains to be done inside of us to create, if you like, if you can use a political phrase, to create a more perfect union of the self and of our community.
All right.
So, any final one-liners?
No, that's none for me. I'm driving.
Okay.
All right.
You drive a hard bargain, Moriarty. The latest model.
Yeah. Oh wow! Thank you, Michael. That was great, and I'm going to stick with the mystical.
Yeah, let's
less mist, more tickle.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you, Joey.
Thanks, Michael. All right. Bye.